who's in charge of the church, and how do I interact with that, and when should I obey the leadership of the church, not obey? What do we do with that? And who decides that? And that kind of wrestling. These are the things that we're going to work through in this video. Now, this video is a part of a series of videos that on our channel, Bethel Assembly of God or Bethel Pittsburgh, we've put in a playlist on our channel titled The Disciple. And in that, it's categorized on the different categories we're walking through. And I'm adding a video category by category each week. This category is church philosophy. Now, the word philosophy is just the way we think about things. Some philosophy is bad, but philosophy in general is just thinking about things, and in and of itself, it's not bad. So, how do we think about church? What is it that we think about church? And that's particularly with authority structure and leadership and decision making. That's really what we're looking at here. And how are we to view this? So the easy answer is Jesus is in charge of his church, right? Right? That's who is in charge. God is in charge. The problem is, though, that what happens is you end up with a group decision that needs to be made, and individuals in the group or certain subgroups in the group or a subgroup in an individual believe that Jesus is telling them to go in a different direction. Sometimes it's even the way I'm interpreting Scripture, that one person is interpreting Scripture saying, I need to do this direction, and another group is seeing Scripture saying, I need to go in another direction. And when you're not involved in leadership in the church, then you sometimes are not aware of the many different options that frequently come up and the things we do frequently as to what should we do here. And what do we do in that moment? Who's hearing Jesus correctly? And that's why, and the Bible even does this in the Old Testament as well as in the New, creates a human leadership structure. And the reason is because somebody has to be able to make a decision. That's really ultimately what leadership is centered around, is making decisions. And my experience in pastoring a church, I've been pastoring Bethel for over 7 years, is that there are so many different options that come up frequently. Our building, whether or not we paint, what colors to paint, whether or not we do this project on our structure or that project, whether or not we have pews or chairs, these things come up constantly. What kind of signage we have and decorations, decor we have in the building. Then there comes the service itself. What topics need to be addressed, and how frequently do they need to be addressed, and what angles do they need to be addressed in? Does the service need to be free-flowing, and does it need to be long? The worship, does it need to be longer, shorter, more structured, less structured? Do we need to give an opportunity for people to speak and use their gifts? Do we need to guide that? All of those things are at play. What kind of events and activities do we have? How do we go about outreach? All of those things are questions that surface, and a decision needs to be made. And not everybody always agrees. And sometimes people feel passionately, I believe God's saying this. I think that this is what I'm interpreting Scripture to say. And simply saying, well, Jesus is in charge, which is true, doesn't resolve those conflicts. So we have to have a structure in place to be able to make those decisions. And a dynamic happens here where we can say that, well, then I don't need to be a part of a structure. And a lot of people are doing that. A lot of people are like, I'm not going to be part of an organized church that has a structure. That's what they mean by that, really. They might not know that, but I'm not going to be a part of a structure. And so they remove themselves, whether it's that they don't participate in any church at all, or they go to a church, but their behavior is, I'm not going with different things that this church is doing. I'm just kind of here to receive the benefits and observe certain things, and that's it. And the problem with that is in Hebrews 13:17, The writer of Hebrews says this: obey your leaders and submit to them. And the leaders being referred to are the church leaders, that I'm supposed to obey and submit to some humans that are in positions of leadership. And that's hard for us. And here's the wrestle is sometimes it's fleshly. Sometimes we just want to do what we want to do and we don't want to follow orders. Sometimes it is spiritual in that we believe that to follow that leader's instruction would be to disobey God, whether our conscience or our interpretation of Scripture or both. And we are called to obey God first over any human structure, whether it's a governmental political structure, a work business organization, or the church. We are called to put obedience to God first. But we have to know that we better do that cautiously, because if I'm wrong, I'm disobeying God. That's the way the Scripture views authority. If I'm wrong and God wasn't telling me to resist that, then I am not just disobeying man, I am disobeying God. I might even be standing in the way of the work of God by doing that. And so we need to be very careful. Again, it's not that we can't disobey the authorities within the church. We just need to be very careful and make sure we're really certain that we should do that. And we need to examine Scripture, maybe seek some accountability with some other Christians, but we need to be very careful in doing that because we're called to obey the leadership structure within the church. Now, one of our dilemmas is that there is a choice here in the structure. A larger degree of choice exists if we're involved in a church plant. We're starting a new church, and we're a part of the leadership of the team. Once again, at that moment, things are very new and open, and so you're deciding what's going to be the structure, leadership structure, who's going to be in charge, and how we're going to do that. If you're involved in a church that maybe a pastor resigns or retires and you're looking for a new pastor, some of the structure's there, but some of you involved in the structure are making choices on who the individual is that's going to be in that office and have that position. But for the most part, our choice sets in which kind of structure we're going to enter into. So when we choose to be a part of a church, we're choosing to enter into a structure, and we need to be submissive to the structure that we choose to enter into. Again, like I said, we should be very careful we certainly shouldn't resist being a part of any structure. We can't find biblical justification for that. But we should be careful what structure we choose to enter into, and once we enter in, we need to be obedient to that structure. Now, there tends to be three most common types of structure, and they move from the greatest amount of authority to the least amount of authority consolidated in one individual or a small group of people. So the highest end of that is the Episcopal form of government, and that's one that is a complete hierarchical structure. Probably the most strong leaning in that would be the Catholic Church, that you have an individual that is the decision maker alone of everything that happens below that globally in that church. And then there are certain authority figures underneath that have greater authority the more they move their way up closer to the Pope. There are other churches that are designed that way. Mostly a lot of the liturgical churches lean in that direction. The Episcopal Church would be one of them. Then you move to a more moderate expression of that, where the authority is spread out a little bit more, and that's the Presbyterian model, where you have not just one leader, but you have a group of leaders or a council of leaders that are exercising authority globally over the individual churches, and then someone's placed in authority in those churches and has authority there. And so it's spread out a little bit, but it's still consolidated in a group of people. Then you have a congregational model, and that's where the authority is spread out the most. A congregational model, the membership of the church has authority, and almost everything has to run through the whole of the membership. It kind of works more like a democracy in that regard. And so those are the typical models. They might play themselves out, and you might have a priest or a pastor that is in charge, so to speak, of that local church. But they might also have a board in that church, and the board and the pastor kind of work in tandem with each other on decision making. And depending on the church dynamics, the pastor or the priest might have more of the control, maybe even all of it. In other churches, the board might have more of the control, maybe even all of it, or back and forth between those two. So those are the type of styles. So when we're entering into a church, I'm deciding which style of leadership structure do I want to be a part of. And something we need to keep in mind, if we're honest with the New Testament does demonstrate each one of these forms. And so it doesn't show preference to any one of them. And the New Testament does express a need for authority and a need for hierarchy, and it uses different terms, but it doesn't clearly express how those terms are to be applied and used within especially the local church. And so we just need to be honest with that the Bible isn't fully backing any one of these systems. We also need to be honest that logically, and philosophically, each one of these systems have strengths and weaknesses. And so there is no perfect system that we're going to find. So every system that we choose to be a part of is going to have its set of flaws and weaknesses, and there's no way around it. And like I said in a previous video with church philosophy, we are a bunch of sinful, imperfect, finite, limited people joining together in a group, and there's just going to be problems until Jesus comes back. That's the way it is. And so I can't choose not to enter into a structure because it has some weak points. I just need to decide which weak points bother me the most, and that might guide me into the leadership structure that I enter into. One of those, so if we think, one of the dynamics actually is decision making. When you have an Episcopal form where authority is consolidated into one individual, decisions can be made faster, and so we're not bogged down by like what Congress usually experiences in our country, by a constant delay, and the whole group has to be in agreement, and so then it delays things and it makes it harder to move forward and make decisions. And that's a drawback to your more congregational models, and Presbyterian kind of sits in the middle of that, where the Episcopal church, an Episcopal structure can advance faster. Then there's corruption, and actually we don't realize that there is a risk of corruption in both directions. There's a risk of corruption internally, in that those who have the power within the church could become corrupt and lead the church in a corrupt direction. Then there are the people outside the church, the culture, that can gain access to the direction of the church and corrupt it that way. And each form of government struggles one direction or the other. So obviously the Episcopal form, where there's more authority given to one person, that internal corruption can happen easier because there's not much that can be done because that person is solely in charge. And so if that person becomes corrupted, the whole organization becomes corrupted because they have all the power. However, a congregational model where all the members have the same authority power, depending on the degree of that model, then people from the outside come in and join it. And once they join, they gain power and they gain momentum, and they can corrupt it from the outside. And that's a large risk with the congregational model. The congregational model isn't at risk as much with the internal corruption, but they are with the external corruption. The Episcopal model is not as at risk for external corruption, but they are for internal corruption. And so we just have to know that that's what the risk is with these models. Then there is a consideration on influence in general. So we're moving past the models, and we're asking ourselves, what is actually happening? And here's the thing. In many instances, it doesn't even matter what the structure is. It doesn't matter the person that's in charge. It matters on whether or not people are going to follow. And each of us individually has the ability to influence the direction of the group, even if we're in an Episcopal structure and we don't have any authority, decision-making authority whatsoever, we still carry influence because we can end up in a close relationship with the person who does have power, and we can sway their choices. We can present risk that we're going to leave and go to another church, or we're not going to give anymore, and we're going to affect the finances of that church. And that's going to sway the decision-making of that church, or people begin to see that one person might be a dynamic, charismatic person, and even though they don't have official leadership, decision-making power, many people are drawn to that person and want to give way to that person's opinions, and that carries influence. And we need to know that each of us, to one degree or another, carries some measure of authority because of the dynamic of influence. And we need to choose to be godly with that and respect that and be Christ-like in that and responsible in that. So if, no matter what degree I have, if I have some degree of influence, then I need to make sure that I'm not hindering what the Lord wants to do. And so I don't want to yield my influence to disobey the authority structure if I'm not absolutely certain that God doesn't want to go in that direction. And so I must be careful, even as small as choosing to leave that particular local church. I need to be careful doing that because I'm going to have a negative impact on that church, whether it's that I stop giving financially or I stop serving, or just the knowledge. And I've experienced this at the church I pastor. Just the knowledge that other people have that person has chosen to leave the church has a negative impact and could lead others to do the same. And so I need to be very careful of my actions. And I might not be the pastor, the priest, might not be a pope, I might not be on a board, I might not have a leadership role officially. I still have that to some degree, and I need to be careful what I do. And the same is true for those who are in official titles and positions of authority, that we need to make sure that we, one, respect that. I need to try to make sure I'm sensing what the Lord's will is through a study of Scripture and through discerning His voice, and that I'm leading that direction. But I also need to make sure I'm respecting that people have a free will to choose whether or not they want to follow me or follow this structure, and I need to respect that and be cautious in the way that I live. And it goes different ways. And I think the more we understand the dynamics of authority in the life of a church, the more we might start to do the right things. So be respectful of authority, be respectful of followers, and attempt to follow God's will. And I think that we'll be in a better place. If you have any questions about that, then just leave them in comments. I'd be glad to answer them. I would love it if you would share this video or this entire playlist with somebody else if you want to help them grow in their faith. This would be a way to do that. If you would like to grow in your faith in person and you live in the Pittsburgh area, we're Bethel Assembly of God at 2501 Staten Street. You're welcome to join us Wednesdays at 6:30 and Sundays at 10 a.m. God bless.